Hello, I'm Jake Stone,
I'm Jesse Owens.
and we welcome you to another episode of Generally Particular, a production of the London Lyceum. Generally Particular is a show dedicated to discussing and reflecting on the whole Baptist story. We are a show by Baptists, about Baptists, and for Baptists, as well as Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Lutherans. I am a Calvinistic Baptist, and Jesse is an Arminian Baptist. In the 17th and 18th centuries, we would have been known as a particular Baptist and a general Baptist. And so we brought those together in what we think is a fun way to talk Baptist history, hence generally particular. On our episode today, we are honored to have Dr. Eric Smith from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary joining us to talk about Oliver Hart in our latest installment of Baptist Bios. But before we begin, I think it would be good for our audience to hear Jesse confess to us kind of a little bit of a un-American activity that he participated in last night. Jesse, what would that be?
Yeah, Jake likes to give me a hard time because my sons both play soccer, and I took them to their first MLS game. It was my first MLS game as well, but Jake always tells me that it's a communist sport. So there's that. That won't surprise anyone who regularly listens to this show. So,
Well, some of us have to hold to the old paths around here. So, Eric, thank you for joining us today. And before we get started, could you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's an honor. My name's Eric Smith. I'm married to Candace. We have 3 children. They're 14, 12, and 10. And I pastor a church in Savannah, Tennessee. And I've been on faculty with the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, full faculty since 2022, and taught as an adjunct for several years before that in the church history department. And I'm honored to get to do all those things.
And you also have a long relationship with Union University as well, correct?
I am a very proud graduate of Union University in Jackson. That's where I met my wife, Candace, and I studied in the School of Theology and Missions, and first fell in love with theology and studying the Bible there.
All right. Well, today we're having Eric come on to talk about Oliver Hart, and particularly we're talking about this book, Oliver Hart and the Rise of Baptist America, which is an excellent read. So the first thing I want you to do, Eric, is tell us, who is Oliver Hart?
Great. Thanks for asking. Not many people ask me that, believe it or not. So very happy for the opportunity. Oliver Hart was a very significant Baptist leader in the 18th century. He's born in 1723. He dies in 1795. So he experienced many major events that shaped colonial America, the Revolutionary War, the early American Republic, from the vantage point of a Baptist minister. And he was also just thoroughly connected to just about every major event and figure in Baptist life during that time period. And so I do think that Oliver Hart and his life provide a unique vantage point from which to view the rise of Baptist America. You know, Baptists begin the 18th century small, scattered, disconnected, in some places harassed, oppressed, and they complete the 18th century and enter the 1800s much stronger, larger, growing more numerous, building institutions, preparing to engage in global missions. And so it's just a transformative time period for Baptist in America, and Oliver Hart had a part to play in all that.
And what drew you to, you did your dissertation on Oliver Hart. So, if you're going to spend significant amount of time with somebody, there has to be some reasons why you were drawn to the figure. So what kind of drew you to Oliver Hart?
Yes. So I came to Southern Seminary loving church history, loving Christian biography. That's always been my favorite area of personal edification outside of studying scripture itself. But I did not know a lot about Baptist history. Just had not taken a Baptist history course. I never read a Baptist history book. All my church history heroes were Presbyterians and Anglicans and Lutherans, people from other traditions, and still love all of them. But there was a part of me that would have liked to have known some Baptist heroes, and just had not met any of those yet until I took Dr. Tom Nettles' History of the Baptist course. It was one of those summer intensive Monday through Friday, 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock type classes in a big lecture hall. And I was enthralled. He had me from Monday at 8 till Friday at 5, and I absolutely ate it up. We read his 3 volumes called The Baptist. We read his book called By His Grace and For His Glory. We dug into a lot of primary sources, and I've been hooked ever since. And one of the figures that we met in that course, though, was Oliver Hart. And I was so struck by how instrumental he was in laying the foundations for Baptist life in the South. He seemed to be at the headwaters of so many important institutions and movements in what would become Southern Baptist territory. And I was just amazed. I'd never heard of him before, and was so curious to learn more. And so that's where it all started.
Eric, one of the things you say about Oliver Hart in the book is, so the title's Oliver Hart and the Rise of Baptist America. So you're giving us a lot of the life and ministry of Oliver Hart, but as a window into Baptist in the 18th century. So you said a little bit about this in the intro, but why is Oliver Hart such a fitting figure for serving as kind of a window into Baptist life in the 18th century?
Yeah, so to track Oliver Hart's life and his ministry is really to track the story of Baptist in America during that time period. Just to take one example, we probably think today of the southern United States as being Baptist country. It's the epicenter of Baptist life in the world, maybe. But that was not the case in the early 18th century. Instead, Baptist life was extremely weak in the southern colonies. The South was considered kind of the mission field, frontier territory, a place that was not producing its own Baptist ministers. The few and scattered Baptist churches in the South at that time would always have to send away to England or to Scotland, to Wales, or to some other part of the colonies to find a minister to come and fill their pulpits. It was just not a place where Baptist life was thriving. Oliver Hart's a big reason why that started to change. In the middle of the 18th century, he came and took on the pastorate of the First Baptist Church of Charleston, which most people identify as the mother church of Southern Baptist churches, the First Baptist Church in the South. So he takes on the pastorate of that strategic church, stays there for 30 years until he gets run out during the Revolutionary War for his patriot activity. But when he leaves South Carolina and leaves the South around 1780, it's just a completely different scene. There's now every Baptist pulpit practically is filled with a Bible teaching pastor. There's a discipleship network that's taken root. New ministers are being trained. The kind of rudimentary institutions have been formed. There's a Charleston Association that's gathering all kinds of different Baptists to work together. They're bound together by confession. They have a manual of church order that they're all operating by. Churches are being planted. I mean, just a very different kind of a scene of flourishing Baptist life. He's not the only reason for that, but he was a key player, and I think the most important player in that. He also brings together the two most significant groups of Baptists in that era, the mid 18th century. Those are the regular Baptist and the separate Baptist. I think he's the most important figure for building a bridge between those two groups. So anyway, he kind of oversees the total remaking of the Baptist South. And then he spends another 15 years of productive ministry back in his home territory of the Middle Colonies in New Jersey this time, and gets involved with some important events then too. So anyway, I think if you're wanting to learn about Baptists in the 1700s, you could do a lot worse than to study the life of Oliver Hart.
There's a lot of things that I want to touch on that you just mentioned in that answer. I'll say one thing, talking about Hart's final years when he goes back up into the New Jersey area. That's one of the most striking things in reading your book, was because he had such a blessed ministry in Charleston. and then the war forces him to leave and all of that, and then his last years, by the measurements that we would use, that a lot of people use pragmatically, his latter years did not seem as fruitful, and but yet he was persevering and faithful until the end. I think you have a story in there about a Sunday when it snowed, and he goes and makes his way to the church, and nobody had come, and that really, I think I read it when it was cold here, and so I just but knowing how hard that can be as a pastor in that sense, that really drew me in just in reading and learning more about him.
Well, thanks a lot. You're exactly right. He experienced revival by every measurement when he was in Charleston. He had a lot of influence. He used it for good. He had many, many people looking up to him and kind of following him as a model. He was able to start a lot of really important institutions and movements in the South. He also was effective beyond the bounds of the Baptist Church. He was intimately connected with George Whitefield and many figures related to the First Great Awakening. So it's just a really dynamic period in the South. And to go back to what was, when he came there, the largest Baptist church in the Philadelphia Association, the Hopewell Church, and to see it just kind of steadily shrink and dwindle and struggle and have division and apathy and all kinds of things that anyone who's been involved in ministry for any period of time can identify with. After such a fruitful period, that had to be a challenge for him, especially because back in Charleston, things were booming again under his predecessor, Richard Furman. I think he does provide a good model for how to be faithful in ministry, not only when the good times are rolling, but when you're having to completely walk by faith and trust that God is doing more than we can see.
Can you say a little bit more about his relationship to revival? I think one of the themes that I really loved in your book is not only his desire for revival, but as a pastor, this balance that he was able to maintain. I think that's a consistent theme that you highlight again, to maintain order, like an orderly ministry and even associationalism with revival. So maybe some were given to revival and revivalism, and that diminished maybe their orderliness. And some were more focused on order and were concerned about revival. But he seems to have charted this really nice middle path of maintaining that tension. So maybe say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. When I was first getting into studying Oliver Hart during my PhD studies, step one was just to assemble all of his sources, published, archival, whatever, and just do sort of an inductive study and see what themes were repeated that were clearly important to him. And for me, it was obvious that revival was the golden thread of his life and ministry. He's converted at the peak of the Great Awakening around the Philadelphia area during George Whitefield's second tour of the United States, the really famous one. He is around all of these major Great Awakening figures during his formative years as a Christian and is called to ministry. Then he goes to Charleston and kind of transplants that first Great Awakening revival ardor and fervor, but he weds it to that Philadelphia Association concern for church order and theological order, and a ministerial order. And he's able to bring those two things together in a unique way. And if you've spent much time in Southern Baptist studies, especially, you may recognize those two terms, order and ardor, because for many, many years, those have been sort of the identifying marks of the regular Baptist and the separate Baptist, respectively. A Baptist historian named Walter Sheridan identified the regular Baptist as being primarily concerned with order, theological order, liturgical order, ministerial order, and educated ministry, those kinds of things, and maybe a little bit hesitant to embrace revival. And then he identified the separate Baptist as being much more concerned with ardor, so passionate worship, evangelism, seeking revival, that sort of thing, and much less concerned with order in all those ways that we mentioned. Now, there's some truth to that, but I think it can be overstated as if never the twain ever met, as if they were worlds apart. In fact, I think that both regular and separate Baptists had a lot in common theologically, and they had a lot in common when it came to their shared passion for revival. Now, they expressed it very differently, and there were some cultural distinctions between those two, but I think there was more common ground than is sometimes recognized by historians. And any time a regular and a separate Baptist would actually get together, like Oliver Hart and some of these characters who would meet out on the frontier, like Joseph Reese or whoever, Philip Mulkey, those kinds of guys, whenever they would actually meet up, they would recognize just how much common ground they had. And so Oliver Hart was then very, very forward in welcoming those classic revivalist separate Baptist into the Charleston Association. And so I think if we were to use like Thomas Kidd's description of revival participants, where you have anti-revivalist at one far end of the spectrum who were totally against it, thought it was all kind of man-centered and out of control. And then you've got radical revivalist at the other end who have like no restrictions. There's really not a lot of biblical discernment going on. It's just if it looks emotional and excited, it must be the blessing of God. In the middle, you've got the moderate revivalist who really do believe that God's doing a generational work in their time, but it still needs to have some biblical guardrails with it. The kind of thing that we see Jonathan Edwards trying to do in his most mature works. I think that's exactly the line that Oliver Hart tried to walk, and that's why I find him to be such an attractive figure and a compelling model.
Yeah, Eric paints the scenes for what took place in some of those separate Baptist church services. And I mean, I've preached in a tent revival before, but what was going on among the separates is something I've never witnessed, and it would scare me. But to think about,
I got after
Oliver,
it.
yeah, and to think about Oliver Hart being able and his ability to bridge those gaps, and it's such a testimony to really his personality, and I think also his desire of really wanting to seek good fellowship and union. You got a statement early in the book, Eric, that I think is really good, and I'd like for you just to kind of expand on. You said Hart's potent combination of Baptist precisionism and evangelical revivalism proved to be instrumental in Baptist expansion in the South in the mid 18th century. How was Oliver Hart a Baptist precisionist and yet was really able to be lowercase c Catholic in his deportment and his relationships?
Sure. Thanks for asking me that. So the Baptist precisionism comes from being born and bred in the cradle of the Philadelphia Association, where he had a pastor named Jenkyn Jones, who was a Welsh Calvinistic Baptist and preached from the doctrines of what probably a lot of your listeners know as the Second London Confession, the 1689 Confession, which the Philadelphia Association then adopts and alters just slightly in the slightest of ways to make it the Philadelphia Confession. So those are the theological truths that are really foregrounded in his church life and associational life, and he receives that kind of theological precision, also an ecclesiological precision. These are people who are thinking very carefully about church membership and baptism and church discipline and how autonomous local churches can cooperate with other local churches for their mutual good, for the advance of the gospel without compromising the integrity of a Baptist congregation. So he is just steeped in this very robust Baptist church life. And yet he also has in Jenkyn Jones, his pastor, the example of a minister who's not afraid to welcome evangelical revival and a truly gospel-centered ministry that's leading to genuine conversion for just scads and scads of people in the middle colonies whenever George Whitefield shows up around 1739 and 1740. And so Jenkyn Jones, his pastor, who is the leader of the Philadelphia Association in his generation, is regularly inviting evangelical revivalist preachers who are being blessed of God and used of God, even from other denominations, into his own pulpit to preach to his people, to preach to the broader community. He's paying visits to Whitefield. He's linking arms with ministers from other traditions, other backgrounds for the cause of revival. And so, and that's just sort of embedded then in Oliver Hart's DNA. He's like 18 years old when all of that is going on. And so he is saved, he's converted, and professes faith in Christ during all of that. And so that's the model of ministry that he carries with him down to Charleston. And so I say in the book, Oliver Hart's not this real original thinker. He's not some innovative theologian. He never writes a systematic theology textbook. I don't know that he was the best preacher in the world. He was faithful and sound and all that, but he's not dramatic and dynamic in the way that Whitefield was. But what he was really, really good at was taking a healthy biblical model of ministry that he experienced in one place and then reproducing it somewhere else and spreading it. And he was also really good at relationships. He was excellent at building bridges with fellow Baptists, even Baptists of a different background, like the separate Baptists, also non-Baptist. He always was clear where he stood when it came to church order issues, but he would walk with you as far down the road as he possibly could for the sake of preaching the gospel, seeing people come to know the Lord and walk in holiness before him. And I think he's kind of a unique figure in that way, and a lot of fun to watch.
You mentioned that Hart comes from a Quaker family. I wasn't actually aware of that, but that's not uncommon among some Baptists in the American context, and then even in the English context as well. Can you give us a little bit of detail, kind of backstory on Hart's family and the transition from Quakerism into Baptist life?
Sure. His grandfather comes over to the colony of Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, as a personal friend of William Penn. He's a Quaker, committed to the these and the thous and all the Quaker stuff. And over the course of his grandfather's lifetime, though, he comes under the influence of a fellow Quaker traveler known as named George Keith, who takes a different slant on the Quaker tradition, wants to put, among other things, he wants to put more emphasis on the objective message of the gospel rather than just the internal light, like most Quakers traditionally would have. Really kind of moving things in a more Baptist-like direction. And Oliver Hart's grandfather follows George Keith into Keithianism, and as does Oliver Hart's father. And so they're a part of this Keithian movement, which really ends up being pretty transitional. It doesn't Keithianism doesn't catch fire in America, if you haven't noticed. But it becomes kind of a halfway house between Quakerism and Baptist life for a lot of people, including the Hart family. And so by the end of the life of Oliver Hart's grandfather, he's ministering the word kind of as a convinced Baptist, and that's what sets all these Harts into this Baptist stream.
So one of the things that, in reading about Hart's relationships and his ministry, I find it fascinating to think about that he and John Leland spent some time together. Love to be a fly on the wall because they seem like two very different people. And yet, to me, one of the things that I find fascinating is in Baptist life, and especially in the American context, there has always been this perpetual wrestling between a more populistic wing in Baptist life and a more institutionalist wing. We're by DNA as Baptists, we're populists, we're grassroots, we're from the bottom up. And yet there's been, like Oliver Hart, the Philadelphia Association, the Charleston Association, there's very much this desire to organize and to build. And yet it's always a conflict. You fast forward into the 1850s, you think about somebody like J.R. Graves and the Landmark Movement, which is very much a populist movement. He battles somebody like R.B.C. Howe. Then you move into the 20th century. I mean, J. Frank Norris, versus someone like George Truett. And yet, I would argue it's still with us today. A lot of the battles still take place in Baptist life between those who are more on the populist side and more on the institutionalist side. What can Oliver Hart teach us in how to respect both of those wings, so to speak, of the Baptist movement, understanding you need both of them for the very best Baptist vision to be realized?
Yeah, it's a very thoughtful question. If you go back to the 18th century, especially by the late 18th century, as Baptists are beginning to grow more numerous, there's no escaping the reality that a lot of Baptists want to build institutions so that they'll seem legit to the American public. They kind of have this inferiority complex as they look around at Presbyterians and Congregationalists and Anglicans who've got the pretty churches and their ministers are respected in the community and they've got schools that they can educate their ministers at and all that. And there are a number of Baptist ministers that I might mention who clearly are hungering for respectability that comes from building institutions, and that's really the main engine that's driving them. And it's frankly not very attractive. It seems quite nervous and sort of sad. I have to say, and so on that, there are some populist type Baptists, if you want to use that term, who see right through that and think it's pathetic and tell them to stop and make fun of them, especially John Leland because he's really funny, and will say, "Look, what makes a Baptist great is not that." We get invited to pray at the mayor's prayer breakfast. What makes Baptists great is that we love the Bible and we're trying to take the New Testament seriously at its word. And we follow our consciences under the lordship of Jesus, under the authority of the Bible, wherever it may lead us, even when it's unpopular. That's what's made us a great movement. Let's not sell out now and try to become like the people who were making fun of us and were oppressing us and all that. So anyway, you definitely have that dynamic going on. However, you also have some Baptist institution builders from the 18th century who, as far as I can tell, as I'm reading their writings, you don't see that same kind of nervousness and inferiority and fear of man type stuff going on. They really just want to be as faithful as they can, and they think that they can be more effective if they will build some institutions. And so I think Oliver Hart is actually a good example of this. He's not a perfect man at all. If you read the book, you'll see that. But I do think here he does hit the mark a lot better than either of those extremes, because instead of going to anti-education like a populist Baptist might, or on the other hand being kind of this hungering for respectability. I just want somebody to call me doctor or reverend instead of brother. On the other end, you have Baptists like Oliver Hart who understand what makes a minister is God's call and God's gifting by the Holy Spirit, and no education can make up for that. No university can confer the gifts of the Holy Spirit on you. That's all God's doing. You don't need a college degree to be a minister of the gospel. However, on our end, insofar as we are able to improve our gifts by being more faithful students of the word, the more effective we can become in rightly dividing the word of truth by gaining some skills in preaching or in theology or whatever, then that's just to the good. That's only going to benefit our local churches. We're going to be able to glorify God through a more effective ministry. So let's take all those opportunities that we can. And I think that's Oliver Hart's stance. He's able to maintain that. He's always pushing Baptists to come together to build some institutions that are going to help solidify this movement that God has begun, but without losing that basic Baptist commitment to Scripture and faithfulness to Jesus that got them started in the first place. He never got too cool to be a Baptist. He always knew we're going to be on the outside a little bit by our commitment to immersion and just these things that seem kind of exotic and strange to sort of the blue bloods of colonial Americans. And that's fine. That's not what we're here for. We just want to be as faithful and effective as we can as we serve Jesus Christ.
I know the purpose of this episode is not to talk about John Leland, but
I'll talk
will
about
you
it
share?
anytime.
Will you share though about his Leland's disdaining of organization, real quick? What he does at the organization of the Triennial Convention when he's invited.
Yes, John Leland would be coming more from a separate Baptist stream, although it's hard to identify Leland in some ways with any group of Baptists. He's just John Leland. He's also one of the most effective preachers and Baptist voices in early America for the gospel as well as for religious freedom. Y'all know all that. But around the time that Baptists are getting really excited about organizing for missions and a bunch of other stuff too, at the time of the founding of the Triennial Convention in Philadelphia, it's going to lead to Baptists adopting all these sorts of structures and amenities that other denominations have: colleges, newspapers, magazines, home mission boards, foreign mission boards, all that stuff. Around that time, when everyone is saying this is the apex of the Baptist story, like we are entering our golden era, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened. John Leland is in town in Philadelphia after being on some circuit preaching the gospel out in the sticks. And of course, they ask him to preach because he's in town and he's John Leland. And he basically lets everybody have it that they're like the Israelites trying to go back to Egypt. You know, they've forgotten where they've come from. They're trying to be like, you know, our big brothers, the Congregationalists, and it's sad, it's pathetic. Just stop it. Just preach the gospel. Go tell somebody about Jesus and quit trying to imitate everybody else. So he really kind of rains on that parade, or he's really puncturing the balloon of pretension, and that's what John Leland did better than anybody.
I could see Jake doing that. Can you see you could do? I could see you doing that.
I think John Leland's one of those people I would enjoy being around for a spell of time, but I could see that it probably could become a taxing experience after a while.
He'd push you, man. He'd push you.
We were going to discuss your John Leland book, but I told Jake we'd have to wait for the paperback to come out on that one.
I hear you. Maybe there's a great outcry from the people. The
Yeah.
publishers will give them what they want.
They'll relent.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure Jake has some other questions to ask about Oliver Hart. So Jake, if you have those, go ahead. I do want to ask you in a moment about balancing local church ministry and scholarship. But Jake, what else do you have on Hart?
Last really big question. Eric, do you think it's right to call Oliver Hart the father or the grandfather of the Southern Baptist Convention?
Yeah, definitely wouldn't be the father because he's too far back for that. There's too big of a gap between his life and ministry and the founding of the Southern Baptist Convention. Maybe the grandfather. Actually, I think he's probably more like the great grandfather. So I'm going to say Oliver Hart's the great grandfather because he starts the first Baptist Association and adopts the first Baptist Confession of Faith in the South, and does the first training of ministers in the South. He does so many of the things that the SBC will do later on, including pooling money to send out evangelists and just all the stuff. He does all that, 100 years before the founding of the SBC. After him, though, is Richard Furman, who is his younger friend and in some ways his protege. He ends up following him at First Baptist Charleston. Furman takes it much further. I think he is driving in exactly the same direction that Oliver Hart would have in developing the Charleston Association. He's the first president of the Triennial Convention. He starts the first state Baptist convention in America, which is in South Carolina, and it really advances the ball of Baptist institutionalism in the South. Then after Richard Furman comes Basil Manley Sr., who will also be a successor at First Baptist Charleston. He's truly the father of the Southern Baptist Convention, if I had to give that title to somebody. I mean, he's right in there with people like R.B.C. Howell and W.B. Johnson and all of them. But I think if I had to call somebody the father of the SBC, it'd probably be Basil Manley Sr. And so he's in the lineage of Oliver Hart. And certainly knew him and admired him and spoke of him. But I think that makes Oliver Hart the great grandfather.
And then you think about, and that stream is where James Pettigrew Boyce comes out of. And
That's
so
right.
It's just fascinating to see all of those kind of connections in that one geographic location.
Yeah. So Boyce talks about seeing Basil Manley Sr. wearing a black Geneva gown to preach in with bands, which seems so formal and high churchy to us as Baptists. And it was even then, that was an unusual move. But Basil Manley Sr. is really just carrying on a tradition that began with Oliver Hart. And it's been hard to track down like why exactly he did that. To me, what makes the most sense is it's an homage to George Whitefield, his greatest hero in ministry.
Well, one thing's for sure is John Leland and J.R. Graves were not wearing Geneva.
You wouldn't catch John Leland in a black gown and bands. You'd have to knock him out, stuff him in that thing.
You did have an interesting story in there where I guess sometimes when Whitefield was in town, he would attend First Baptist there,
Yes.
and he wouldn't even be preaching. So let's see. Hart invited John Gano to preach, and he gets up and looks out there and sees George Whitefield. That must have been an alarming experience.
Yeah, at a point in Gano's ministry when he's essentially like a student preacher. I mean, he's just beginning to preach his first sermons, and so Oliver Hart gives him an opportunity. That's the kind of thing that Oliver Hart did all the time. And he gets up, and George Whitefield's in the crowd that day. So that is instructive to us on a number of levels. One thing that it shows us is just how closely connected Hart and Whitefield were. And that's just one of many examples that we could give of how they worked together and worshiped together. And Hart did like follow-up ministry for Whitefield at Charleston after his revivals. And anyway, that's a really unique relationship, I think.
So Eric, I wanted to ask you, so you're a local church pastor. I can imagine, like everyone in ministry knows, that takes a lot of your time. But you've published, several books, including 2 with Oxford. How do you balance ministry, family life, and scholarship? Well, what are some things that you would say you found helpful, maybe through the influence of others, that have helped you take care of your responsibilities in the local church and with your family, but also be disciplined and find the time to write?
Sure. Well, that's kind of you to ask. I don't know that I do it particularly well. I'll say that I desire to keep my priorities in order, which is to be a faithful Christian, faithful husband and dad, and then a faithful pastor. That's my day job. That's my primary calling. And then from there, I've just tried to pray Psalm 37:4, delight yourself in the Lord and he'll give you the desires of your heart. And I just really love Baptist history, and I love scholarship in general. And I've loved Southern Seminary in particular. It's been so formative for me. And so basically my goal has been ever since I began this course of studies, and then after I graduated, is while I'm pastoring and leading my family and all of that, Lord, if you give me some time to work on this, I'm going to give it my very best, and I'm just going to see what you do with it. And so that's what I've tried to do. And the Lord has been just abundantly generous to me and given me opportunities to write, and far beyond anything that I expected. But I've only written stuff that I want to write. So I've not had contracts on any of these books ahead of time. I've not written a bunch of book reviews to kind of get my foot in the door, because I just hate writing book reviews. And I don't, the time is super limited. And so if I only have a sliver of time to write, I want to spend it writing what I want to. And so that's what I've done, really just out of the sheer enjoyment of it, of learning and writing and crafting something, and then just asking the Lord to do with it what he wants to do with it. And so I've tried to just stick with that route. And I get up really early in the morning. And so my mindset is, this is kind of an extra thing. It's something that I, in a sense, feel called to do, and I have a passion to do it, but it's outside of those other responsibilities that we talked about. So if I want to make this happen, I need to have some skin in the game, and I need to get up really early and do it. And so that's what I've done. I'm not sitting at my desk at work during the day at church writing books about Oliver Hart. I'm not going home at the end of the workday while my kids are running around or they're eating supper writing about John Leland. It's not like that. It's dark outside. No one else is conscious, asking me things or sending me emails, and that's my time to work and to write. And if I don't do that, I'm probably not going to write. And because I want to, that's kind of gotten me up out of bed day by day through the years. And so I've just kind of chipped away at it a little at a time, and asked the Lord to make of it what he wants to make of it. And I'm grateful that he's let me do some writing.
That's an awesome answer. Thank you so much.
It is. Now the last thing I want to ask Eric is you asked before we started recording, was this an inflammatory podcast? So I want to ask you the most controversial question of this episode. The title of this book is Oliver Hart and the Rise of Baptist America. Was Oliver Hart a Christian nationalist?
That's a great question. You know, in a sense, certainly he was. He's got this amazing published sermon that he preached in conjunction with the very first official Thanksgiving that President George Washington called. And Oliver Hart preaches this message when he's up in Hopewell, New Jersey. It's called America's Remembrancer. America's Remembrancer. If you wanted to Google that, you could probably track it down. And he takes his text from Deuteronomy, that, I think it's surely no enchantment shall stand against Israel, or something like that. Basically, God's covenant people are protected by him. He has a purpose for them, and no weapon formed against them shall prosper. The Balaks of the world can't call down curses on them, even if they hire Balaam against them, all that kind of thing. That was his text. And then he traces out the story of America and shows step for step how God has providentially cared for them, planted them, established them, given them victory through the American Revolution, and how now America has these glorious prospects set before them if they will be covenantally faithful to the Lord and live under his word and seek to be faithful Christians and render to him for all of his benefits, thankful hearts and pious lives and all this kind of thing. And so, yes, I think Oliver Hart would say to as much as a Baptist can. I mean, he's going to couch it in a Baptist way because he does believe in religious liberty in a particular way. But he would be much more comfortable with that label than his good friend John Leland would.
Well, you told us that Oliver Hart was imperfect, and that
there's your exhibit A.
There it is.
It's a good sermon, though. I recommend it. I recommend you read it.
Yeah, I remember you referencing that, and I was like, this sounds very much like early American Puritans that settled in Massachusetts, the way that they talk about America as the new Israel. That
yes,
very much sounded like that.
And in that same vein, Oliver Hart was not afraid to use the Puritan Jeremiad sermon. In other words, like the prophet Jeremiah would do, connecting temporal disasters and struggles and crises that hit a community to the judgments of God, as he's articulated in the covenant blessings and cursings to his people. And so Oliver Hart does this most famously in a sermon called Dancing Exploded.
Yes.
Of course, he lives in Charleston, which is sort of the peak of high society in the South. There's a lot of rich people there, fancy balls, spending tons of money on gowns, and all these refined manners. They're trying to be like Paris, basically. And Oliver Hart is not down with any of that. And so when things aren't going Charleston's way, South Carolina's way in the war, he connects it to not just literally the act of dancing, but just sort of this whole culture of kind of worldly carelessness and frivolity. And he says, look, if y'all want to win this war, you better get right. What else does God have to do to get your attention? And but that's straight out of the Puritan playbook as well. It's kind of taking that covenantal model and mapping it on in the present day.
Well, Eric, I really appreciate you being on here with us today and talking about Oliver Hart. Brooks Holyfield wrote a book on gentleman theologians, and I would say that you are a gentleman historian in a lot of ways. And I really appreciate all the work, and I'm hoping that this will earn me extra credit in the PhD program here at Sutter. So hey, you got to do what you got to do. So, but really appreciate you being on and all the work that you're doing. Can you tell us about any projects that you're working on or that are upcoming that you can share? with us.
I appreciate that question. So I've completed a biography of John A. Broadus, one of the founders of Southern Seminary, and that is in the publication phase, and just got an email about that today from LSU Press, and it should be out at the beginning of 2026. And so it's being, final proofs and all that stuff are happening right now. So I'm very excited about that. And so with that project sort of in the books, moving forward to kind of some smaller chapter contribution types of things, but I'm really interested in a larger project on E.Y. Mullins, who was a major Baptist theologian in the early 20th century, also a president of Southern Seminary, and I think a pivotal figure in the Baptist story. So very interested in digging into Mullins more, but that's still in the early stages.
If I might also give a plug to show my job here, one reason that Eric writes such great books is because of the resources here at the James P. Boyce Centennial Library.
He's 100% correct.
And with that, we appreciate you tuning in to us today. And as we like to always say, stay Baptist.
Stay Baptist.